I think the other thing that will happen with the parliamentary party is that overall it will move towards the centre, and this great contrast between this country where both parties moving to the centre, and then the rest of the Western world is becoming more and more polarised.
Aren't the activists moving more to the right?
Exactly, and so you've got this bigger gulf than ever between the Conservative MPs and the Conservative activists.
And if the activists are presented with two centrist, boring candidates, they're going to be really unhappy with that.
Well, I suspect they won't be. I suspect they'll be presented with one right-wing candidate and one centrist. Or I mean, I don't think it'll be Tom Tugendhat who'll get in, but I think, somebody probably cleverly, and one of the right-wingers is where that will then go to the activists.
But Reform's been a really interesting story of this election campaign. They had a huge moment of breakthrough, that crossover moment in the polls, where they sort of crossed over with the Conservatives, but now they are in a bit of trouble. They've had to drop a number of candidates today over these sort of racist and offensive comments. Michael, you're a real watcher of Reform. You've written a biography on Nigel Farage. What do you make of the trouble that Reform have got itself into?
Well, they told us when Tice was running the show, Richard Tice was running it, that they were going to vet all these candidates carefully. And of course, they've run into Farage has run into this kind of problem in the past when he was running UKIP and the Brexit Party, as it then was. And so it was entirely predictable that they wouldn't be able to vet everybody. None of the parties have been able to vet everybody properly, as we've seen. But they have run into trouble in a rather bigger way than I expected. Will it change their vote? I'm not sure it will, actually. I think the public realise that there are wrong-uns and racists in every party, and that probably you would expect Reform to have rather more than most. But will it affect their overall? I don't think it will.
What do you think, John?
Well, I suppose the reason for there wasn't much vetting was because the election was called much earlier than most people were expecting.
Yeah.
And to be fair, the Tories still had loads of seats to fill.
And I thought, following on from what Michael's just said, I thought I watched the Nigel Farage Question Time programme last night, and I thought he really threw his predecessor Richard Tice under the bus.
Oh, he's been doing that for the last few weeks, yes.
But on this particular point, he said, I inherited a start-up party. And so he basically said it wasn't his fault.
Well, he was the majority shareholder. He should have done something about it.
He's like the boss of Reform, right?
But in terms of Reform, I mean, I was reading in various newspapers today the suggestion that Reform have peaked, where they're not going to get any higher in the polls. I was speculating in a piece I wrote for the Sky News website last night. Was this the day that the wheels started to come off the Nigel Farage bandwagon? Now, he's had two things have happened in the past week. There was his, in my view, rather silly blunder by suggesting that the West gave Vladimir Putin an excuse to invade Ukraine, which will have offended many people in the UK who, as I think I said here last week, the British people not only took Ukrainians to their hearts, but they took many Ukrainians into their homes as well. That was a mistake. That caused him down. And then this, I dare say there'll be those who say, so what? Some potential Reform voters, but some of those wavering Tories who are considering voting Reform, I think they might be thinking again. And of course, the events of the past week, the two things I've mentioned, two things really. One, will it persuade some Tory potential for Reform voters to think again? And secondly, surely it will knock on the head this crazy idea, the likes of Suella Braverman and Jacob Rees-Mogg, that Mr Farage should be welcomed into the Tory party.
I think that happened a while ago. I mean, on the thing about Russia. Oh, sorry, we must let Kat go.
We'll come back to you, Mike. But Kat, what's your reflections on where the Reform story is going? Because I see now that Reform have reported Channel 4 for doing this investigation, and they're saying it's all a stitch up.
Yeah, I was before I came on, I was speaking to the Electoral Commission to see what, if anything, they're planning to do about it. I haven't heard anything definitive, but I was told that their focus is usually more on campaign finances rather than on this kind of issue. So it may well be that Reform has kind of lodged a complaint with the wrong people, that they might have to take it to the police if that's really what they want to do. But then, that there will be a search for evidence, and that evidence may not appear. The problem is, of course, that's not going to happen anytime this side of the election. But just to the point, picking up on the point that John was making there about the sort of some sort of wavering Conservative voters, I think what's been really interesting is since Farage kind of made his comments about Ukraine, we've seen sort of incrementally some Conservative senior figures, started by James Cleverly, but increasingly sort of more vocal as the week has gone on, people coming out and being very critical of the party and of the some of the candidates and some of the comments. And of course, to see Rishi Sunak make that very personal comment about how it affected him and talking about his daughters, you could see that actually it has hurt him. And previously, he has refused to engage with any of the sort of implied comments that have been made when they've sort of been saying about Rishi Sunak, someone that doesn't understand our culture. He hasn't gripped with that. But this obviously was so explicit that he has done. And to me, that suggests two things. One, I think there clearly is a red line that has been crossed. But two, I think that we all know that campaigns are sort of focus grouped and that people kind of check out what real people are thinking and saying. And I do wonder whether they have established from polls and voters that they're speaking to that actually it's okay to criticize reform, and there probably will be a bit of a backlash from people that are very strongly in the reform camp. But for those who are wavering, I think it might remind them that actually the Conservatives do still have a voice and are an alternative.
I think you're absolutely right about that Rishi Sunak interview, because Rishi Sunak has been, he doesn't really like talking about racism or anything like that, and he said very firmly he doesn't think Britain is a racist comment. And when he did that interview, you could sort of see the hurt in his voice, and I thought it was a very human and emotional interview, and saying thinking of my daughters having to listen to that. John,
the other point about that is he said I think he was talking to the journalists, it was up in Teesside, he was on a visit to Teesside, Redcar I think it was. He told the journalists afterwards he'd spoken to his wife because he wasn't sure whether he should repeat the words that were used. And he said he'd spoke to his wife and they agreed between that he should repeat it. And I thought the two things that were significant were, first thing he mentioned was his two daughters. They're 13 and 11, I think I'm right in saying. And then to repeat the thing. I mean, normally when somebody says something outrageous and another politician is asked for a reaction, they don't repeat it. They say, I wouldn't use that sort of language. And he was visibly angry. I mean, I think that he was probably as angry as we've seen Rishi Sunak in the 20 months or so since he's been Prime Minister. Either at his... I mean, he was pretty combative at the debate with Sir Keir Starmer in Nottingham on Wednesday evening, and it gets a bit heated at Prime Minister's questions from time to time. But that was the most angry I think we've ever seen him.
Yeah, and also, of course, he doesn't like bringing in his family, or and this is true of all leaders these days. They're much more careful about bringing in their family and so on. And he went against that. I was going to make the point on the Russia thing that the extraordinary thing about Farage was that because Farage got so angry about that, he let the story run for several days. In a way that I mean, when did he do the interview? It was Friday night of last week, with Nick Robinson on Panorama. And Farage kept going back as if it was, an attack. Well, it was an attack on him. But he persistently refused to condemn Putin in the strongest possible language. It was quite strong language, but it wasn't as strong as it would have been with most politicians, saying that this man is basically a mass murderer, is responsible for kidnapping tens of thousands. He never came out with any of that kind of language. It was a milder form of condemnation of Putin. And you combine that, of course, remembering the sort of the quite warm things that Farage has said about Russia and Putin in the past. Was. I think that was a more uncomfortable problem for Farage than this.
Well, I think there's two things. I think that the Russia comments have actually done quite a lot of damage, particularly to those maybe wavering Tories who do really care about that and the sort of patriotic sort of military side of things. That does, and NATO and all of those things does matter. But I think on this allegation of racism, because the language was so horrible and it did go to Sunak, I think it does show that there are, even though there's lots of blurred moments on these discussions, whether they're culture war or immigration or whatever, there's a line for a lot of Conservatives, and they felt that that line was very, very much crossed. I just want to read a message in from Kate in Warwick, who says, but why does everybody, including Sunak, talk as if this is something Nigel Farage said? Some random bloke walks into the office and is a racist. Why is this the fault of Nigel Farage? Racist buys milk and bread from Tesco's. Should we get the CEO of Tesco's to apologise? This is Kate in Warwick. So, John, Kate's putting the question that this is all unfair and Nigel Farage, this is just some bloke. Why should Nigel be responsible for this?
Well, he's a supporter, a campaigner. I don't know whether it was a setup or not, as Mr. Farage and Richard Tice allege. But the fact is, he was an activist working for the party. And let's not forget, anybody reading yesterday's Times would have seen the splash story was all about how another, I think it was a candidate in one of the seats, was talking about, was it shooting migrants, target practice and stuff like that.
Migrants.
And there was another candidate who was in the Times story was talking about making some dreadful misogynist comments, and another one some racist comments. The 3 or 4 of those things all taken together made it for a very bad day. Can I just say I agree with what Kat said about the Russian remarks a week ago. It was a bit of a turning point for the Tory response to Farage, because up to that point they'd left him alone because they rather feebly thought to themselves, "Oh, a lot of our supporters quite like Nigel Farage," and it's only in the past week that they've really started to have a go at him. And you mentioned James Cleverly, who I think's having a good campaign, auditioning for the Tory leadership campaign when it happens. And others who, and as I say, Mr. Sunak, he gave on Friday also, he gave an interview to the Telegraph. Their splash was all about how Sunak calls Farage an appeaser.
I mean, the other interesting thing, of course, is that you say that everybody's made it clear that Farage is not welcome. Well, that actually contrasts with last October at the Tory conference.
Yes.
And Sunak said he would be welcome.
And danced with Priti Patel, as I recall.
He was the
even
superstar of the conference,
Even
right?
Tom Tugendhat, when I asked him at a Fringe meeting, admittedly, he probably wasn't expecting the question, said he would welcome Farage into the party. Well, and now that it's a serious proposition, I think they've been thinking about it, and they realise that doing dealings with Farage, it leads to trouble, and he generally falls out.
It would be like Labour taking George Galloway back, wouldn't it?
Take a step back, and I just want to get your reflections on this campaign. You know, some of the most surprising bits of the campaign, stuff that you weren't expecting, anything that really stood out for you. We will also move on after the news to look ahead. You know, what is the future government going to look like? What's it going to be like for the Labours and the Tories? Get your reflections on that. But Kat, I'll start with you. What have been your reflections of this campaign so far?
Well, I mean, the thing that I came out of nowhere and has really dominated has got to be Gamblegate. I mean, I can't. I think people are still sort of, trying to fathom how someone could be so silly as to, potentially ruin their entire political career for the sake of £100 bet. And it seems to have travelled very far, and it continues to rumble on. And this is probably the first time that it hasn't dominated the news agenda because of the Farage and reform stuff. But, those investigations are still going on. It's been reported that Liam Booth-Smith, who's one of Rishi Sunak's very close advisors, has been interviewed by the Gambling Commission. No suggestion that he is a suspect in this, but it's clearly part of the process. And that shows you just how close it's getting to Rishi Sunak. It was, I think, one of the first 1 or 2 questions that he was asked in the final leaders debate this week. It's still very much in people's mind. And the problem that Rishi Sunak has is he can say that he gets angry about it, to the point that everyone has been making. Actually, you can see when he's visibly angry. The video talking about these comments today has been much of a different order. But the problem is that it feeds into this kind of overall sense of the Conservatives, with all of the many sort of standards issues that have been coming up over the last few years, that it is a tired party, and therefore we have this kind of willingness to sort of buy into the Labour argument for change.
So Gamblegate has stood out for you. John, what are your reflections of the campaign? What do you think is the most surprising thing of this campaign for you?
Well, I suppose Gamblegate was a surprise. Just on that was my story, the Liam Booth-Smith interview.
Oh, there
And
you
the
go.
day
There you
before,
go.
I revealed that Craig Williams had a pretty long interview with the Gambling Commission as well. But, I mean, just from my personal point of view, I have been to 7 TV debates. The two between Starmer and Sunak, and then there was a Sky News event, the Sun event, and then I went to the two when there were 7 people debating, and then there was the other question time thing as well. What struck me was how combative, pugnacious, I've seen him described as Sunak was in both the very first one, that was the ITV head-to-head.
That's the Julie Etchingham one.
That's right, yes. That was at it was in Salford
Oh,
at
Salford.
the Coronation Street Experience. Talk about the soap opera of politics. And then the last one, which was Wednesday night at Nottingham Trent University. And I was slightly surprised at Sir Keir Starmer's sluggishness, if you like, in responding to the tax attack. The very first one, Mr. Sunak kept banging on about this £2,000 Labour tax grab. And I happened to talk to Sir Keir in Nottingham on Thursday morning, and we were chatting about the various debates. And what he told me was, I'm sure he won't mind me telling this story, he said that he didn't hit back straight away because Julie Etchingham said, we'll come back to tax. And that his chance never came, so he said. But but the point I suppose I want to make about the TV debates, have they really influenced how people will vote? I mean, the standout memories are obviously Sunak going on the attack on tax and Starmer not great. I also remember just after the D-Day fiasco, I mean, Kat's right to mention the Gamblegate, but also D-Day was a pretty big moment as well.
Yeah.
Where the PM left early, inexplicably. God, what was he thinking? And of course, the debate shortly after that, Penny Mordaunt saying he was completely wrong.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks, Penny.
Cheers for that, Pen.
So that's the thing I've been covering, apart from among other things. I've not been out on the road on the buses. I did all that when I was younger.
when you were the future.
Yeah.
When you were a rising star. But I think you make a really good point about the debates. I don't think these debates, like, it's not like the Biden-Trump debate, which has been, I think, kind of absolutely game-changing. There was no game-changing moment. But what I would agree with you is that I think what it showed is actually Rishi Sunak is quite punchy in a debate. Like, he can, land his messages very. You might not like his messages. He might have been seen as quite aggressive, but he knows how to dominate one of those debates. And I think one thing people were a bit surprised about by Keir Starmer is having been this great prosecutor and, the top prosecutor. I think people were expecting him to be a wee bit more nimble on his feet. But I was speaking to somebody about this. There was a big Labour shindig this week. That there was a memorial for a woman called Margaret McDonough, who used to be the General Secretary of the Labour Party under Tony Blair. And the great and the good, all the clans of the Labour movement kind of gathered, and Tony Blair made this big speech. But what a lot of people were discussing the debates, and somebody made the point that in a court you don't actually have to jump in because you look to the judge. And I think that was quite interesting. I think you saw Starmer almost looking to the moderator to save him, and that didn't happen. You've got to be really punchy in these debates. He should have got in and rebutted that £2,000 straight away. Even if Julie Etchingham said no, we'll come back to it, he should have been like, no. His killer instinct should have been to get in there and say, I'm not having that, that's a lie, or whatever.
And of course, in Prime Minister's questions, the speaker
Moderates
referees
it.
as
But you
well.
see, it's a long time since Starmer's been in court, and even when he was a young barrister, I don't suppose he wasn't as he wasn't really doing criminal stuff, and I'm not sure his court cases would have been that combative. I think, and of course, when he was CPS, he wouldn't have been in court himself, apart from perhaps occasionally as an observer.
Yeah.
I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, normally the debate, I find that, I know they came in 2010, and there was the first one which was amazing with Clegg and all of that, and then after that they've been tedious since then, and very
Sky
rarely.
News event was very good.
Of course,
Grimsby.
That
but
was good, actually.
this year they've been particularly good. The thing about the gaffes is that they're very easy things for the public for everybody to understand. D-Day, very, very clear what was wrong there. That the gambling thing, what was wrong there. Often with political scandals, they're a bit obscure and it's a bit difficult to make your mind up. These have been very stark gaffes by the Conservatives, as indeed is the one that has been hanging all over them for years now, which of course is Partygate. Again, a very easy thing for the public to understand. So it's the drip, drip, drip of damaging gaffes. I think it's been one of the most interesting elections that I've been involved in the last 50 years. I mean, we've had some tedious elections. The 21 and 2005 were both pretty awful. This one, there's been something pretty much every day.
Just
Actually,
going back to the debate. I was going to say the other thing that Starmer was wobbly on was the questions about his support for Jeremy Corbyn.
Okay, Kat, you want to come in?
Well, my big surprise actually is really that it's been an interesting campaign, because the outcome, obviously, we still wait to hear, but we assume it will be what the polls have been saying for weeks and weeks and months and months. The outcome is not changing, and nothing sort of dramatic has happened there. But there has been so much happening, and lots of kind of interesting turmoil, candidates being dropped by parties left, right and centre, gaffes are galore. It has been a fascinating campaign to cover, even if the end result is what
we know the result, but we don't know the score.
Also, just to flag up to our listeners, look, we had a long chat with John Curtis, and just to remind people of the numbers that he gave us: Labour 450, Tories 100, Lib Dems 50, SNP 20, Reform around 6, Green around 2, 3, Plaid Cymru probably around 2. I mean, he said these are not predictions. This
Is that today?
Yeah, that was today. But I mean, he was very clear that's not his prediction. That's just looking at all the polls. However, I just want us to flag up to our listeners very briefly before we go to the news. There could be some upsets in terms of quite big Labour names losing their seats. Michael, do you want to just run us through a couple of seats and names we should be looking out for?
Well, I'm not quite. Well, of course, the Labour might lose Islington North, of course, with Jeremy Corbyn against Praful Naden.
Although the numbers were not looking good for Corbyn.
That's interesting now, yeah.
But there's a couple of seats like I think Jess Phillips,
Debonair.
Shabana Mahmood. Kat,
if
you've got any insight on this, because I think there's just a few things just to keep our eyes out for.
Yeah, I mean, so the seat that Thangam Debonair is looking to be re-elected in, the boundary slightly changed, but it's really where the Green Party co-leader Carla Denyer is going, and they have been putting all of their might in that seat. So that is one that I think Labour are worried about. I think slightly less concerned, but definitely one to watch, is Birmingham Ladywood, which is Shabana Mahmood's seat. And here there is an independent candidate that's been endorsed by George Galloway, that's running very strongly on a pro-Gaza platform. He has got into a bit of bother himself. He's been found to have made some misogynistic comments on a podcast earlier this year, but I should think that probably won't have the level of cut through that some kind of the campaign gaffes have had. But they are the two ones that I think Labour are.
He's called Ahmed Yaqub, and I think that's worth keeping an eye on.
And he did very well in the mayoral election, didn't he? And that was across the region, whereas of course this is one seat with a very strong Muslim population. So
I mean, West Streeting has got a large Muslim population as well. I mean, I don't think it loses seat, but all I'm just saying is there could be a few Labour upsets on the night as well. I'll just read out a couple of messages. Penn's messaging saying, "Hi Ayesha, in past elections the trade unions have always seemed to feature highly. I can't recall them being mentioned at all this time, and I listen mainly to Times Radio." Mark's messaging saying, "Before the debates I was going to spoil my ballot. I'm now 50-50 if I'm going to vote Labour." Paul from Camden has messaged in saying, "Ayesha, reports on Starmer's legitimate salvo at reform bigots duck his own ills. Labour's cruelty towards Diane Abbott, the party's Islamophobic acts on Faiza Shaheen's candidacy, the suspension imposed on the gay MP candidate Russell Moyle. Anyone who votes for red Tories colludes with racism and homophobia." And lots of nice messages coming in about this being our fourth anniversary and my literal fourth anniversary, because I started 4 years on this Saturday, and Lisa's mentioned saying we're the best listeners because we have the best presenters. The reason why some of us suffer FOMO and will probably need to get a life. That's true. We all need to get a life, Lisa, but all of us saddos can gather in a safe space here on Times Radio. Look, let's just look ahead. We've done a lot of reflecting on the campaign. Let's look ahead to what might lie ahead for the parties. And of course, still a long way to go. We still haven't had the win. Well, some people have done their postal votes, but caveat. But as we heard from John Curtis, a Labour win is looking very, very likely. I mean, Michael, what do you think we can expect? What are the things you're going to be looking out for?
Well, I mean, are we talking about the formation of the new government?
Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, I think actually, and certainly, I think Starmer should basically appoint his shadow team into those jobs. And I think prime ministers are always tempted to make the odd change, so-and-so doesn't get the Foreign Office and things like that. But I think in this case, I think they should all get the jobs they've had because they've mostly had them for a long time. And I think what we've been missing from grown-up government since the end of the coalition, really, is this constant chopping and changing and people having this portfolio and that portfolio. And
14 housing ministers, for
and
example.
if you give the job to the person who's been shadowing it for 5 years, in some cases, then that is an element of continuity. The problem is, of course, that very few of them have been ministers. And only a handful, really, were ministers under Brown and Blair. So I don't see any big changes now. One of the problems he will face a few months down the road is he's got to work out what to do with what we call retreads, MPs who've come back. And, of course, Douglas Alexander is probably the prime example of that. I mean, he was a cabinet minister under Tony Blair, one of only 3 people in the new House of Commons who were. There we are. There's a quiz question for you. Who are the other 2?
I know Yvette Cooper.
No.
Wasn't that?
No, she wasn't in the cabinet until Brown. No.
Oh.
You'll get one and you won't get the other.
This under Blair.
Yeah.
I mean, Ed Miliband, but he was
No, he
Brown.
didn't. No.
Oh, who is it?
It's Hilary Benn and Stephen Timms.
Stephen was chief secretary, wasn't he?
He was in the cabinet for about 3 weeks.
But in terms of the current shadow cabinet going back, who have had cabinet experience, I mean, it is Ed Miliband, Yvette Cooper, Hilary Benn.
Yeah,
John Healey was a minister.
John Healey.
And they've had, or they were whips or something really small. But those are the problems you got down the road. Now, what do they do in terms of what do they get going straight away? I think if they've got a massive majority, one of the first things they've got to do. I mean, I hope they have got this planning legislation ready because that is going to be a running sore and problem for the whole of the Parliament, particularly if you have a parliamentary Labour Party, many of whom will be representing suburban and very rural seats. I mean, if Macclesfield has a Labour MP or Hexham, or large parts of the home counties might even elect Labour MPs, they are not the types who are going to want the planning laws bulldozed through. Get that legislation through straight away if you're Starmer.
Kat, what are you going to be looking out for? And what are some of the tricky things that a new Starmer government may face, even with this huge majority?
So there is the kind of convention, somewhat arbitrary 100-day point that people will be kind of looking to sort of judge them in. And, I suspect within that time, we'll at least have a date set for the budget, if not the budget itself. But I think a lot of it sort of flows from what Rachel Reeves does in terms of taxes and spending plans and so on and so forth. I was talking to some people earlier this week about, kind of remembering the kind of big Gordon Brown moment that was kept really under wraps when he came in very few days after the 97 election and made the Bank of England independent, and whether Labour might be looking to do something. I mean, no one, I think, probably imagines that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are the sort of temperament to do something of that level of sort of fireworks. and also they are a lot more constrained than New Labour was. But whether there might be some kind of big moment like that is kind of a sort of legacy defining and kind of agenda setting moment. But I think, to be honest, I won't use the phrase that has been published, but let's just say it's Sue Gray's list of doom. There are an awful lot of problems that have been piled up, things like the Thames water issue, which is going to be phenomenally expensive, but really needs to be dealt with.
Prisons is on that watch list.
The
councils
NHS,
going into back.
Universities. I mean, universities are going to go bankrupt, some of them, in the next few months.
It's a big list, and certainly from a lot of people I sort of speak to around Labour, I mean, there is obviously huge excitement about what lies ahead, but real kind of trepidation as well, because of the inheritance is going to be really tough. I mean, John, there could be huge crises that come up, no real honeymoon period, just lots of crises to get through.
Well, Wes Streeting keeps saying he's going to solve the junior doctor strike.
Right.
Well, that's another one, isn't it? As well as
a bit like the miners in February 74.
As well as water companies, prison overcrowding. What are they going to do? I mean, the last TV debate, of course, was stop the boats. I mean, how one of the best line, I think, that Mr. Sunak had all evening. What are you going to do? Talk to the Ayatollahs and do a deal with the Taliban?
That was a good line.
I mean,
actually. That was
his best line.
That was a good
so,
line.
I mean, there's all sorts of problems that they're going to inherit. And I suppose Michael was talking about experienced ministers. Well, Yvette Cooper is probably one of the more experienced members, will be if Labour win, one of the cabinet. Is Ed Miliband going to get into a terrible pickle over his green measures? I mean, he's.
I would say that because I used to work for him, obviously. But I was up in Scotland speaking to a big energy company, and they really like him because of the point that Michael made, which is he knows his brief very, very. I mean, this is a guy who did the brief.
Well, he did the same job before. In fact, he
Yes,
created the
I think
department.
he did the Paris Agreement, one of the climate agreements.
That leads us nicely to one of the questions one of your listeners posed about the trade unions, because of course the only intervention I can recall by a senior trade union leader was Sharon Graham of Unite, who at the big, what they called the Clause 5 meeting, had a clash, I'm told, with Ed Miliband over Labour's plan to basically make everyone who works in the North Sea redundant. And also, of course, the Sharon Graham is very hot on the Angela Rayner package of workers' rights. What will they do on that? I mean, one thing we've not talked about, I think actually, or perhaps did somebody mention it, the money coming in. I've been fascinated the last 2 weeks. The money coming in from, I know this will interest Kat, the Electoral Commission figures. I mean, a week ago, Labour's huge, was it 4 million, I think, was a 2.5 million from Lord Sainsbury of the supermarket dynasty. The most recent figures, which came out yesterday, was 1.5 million from Unison, the trade union. And so the unions, of course, will be unhappy with some of those. If they water down the workers' rights, that'll cause trouble. And as I say, the Unite and the GMB don't like what they're planning for the North Sea.
And on that, Kat, a couple of listeners have messaged in saying, I still don't trust Keir Starmer, and the kind of tone of the questions is, I think once he gets in, he's either going to rip the mask off or he's going to be controlled by Angela Rayner. The Conservatives are sort of really pushing that message as well, or he's going to be kind of more Corbynite than people think. I mean, that's not my sense of, particularly because he's had this huge row with Jeremy Corbyn, and Jeremy Corbyn, if you according to the polls, let's see, is potentially going to lose that seat. But what would you say to my listeners who are messaging in saying, I think he's actually going to go super left wing?
So I think that it's unlikely and extreme that he will suddenly turn out to be a Corbynite. That just doesn't seem to be the sort of man that he is.
I think he's more Thatcherite than Corbynite.
But look, I think there's a lot of pressure on in terms of the taxes, and they have made this commitment around personal taxation, which I think would be very, very unlikely and deeply unwise for them to row back on. In terms of VAT, national insurance and income tax. But as we have all talked about ad nauseum, that leaves a lot of other taxes that could be raised. And I think people might start to feel a bit like, well, this is perhaps not a lie, but it's certainly not telling the full truth. And, we've seen as we were talking about with the debate this week, Rishi Sunak was much more kind of on message and focused in his attacks, and Keir Starmer was still quite woolly on a lot of areas. And they need to sort of have some answers on that front. And it might upset some people, it might delight some people. But just on the sort of union side of things, I think it's really worth noting that Unite hasn't appeared yet at all in Labour's campaign donations that for the start of since the start of the campaign, and this week was really the only time that we've seen any significant money coming in from unions, which I think is really gives you a sense of the sort of threads that kind of bind Labour with the union movement, certainly under Starmer, seem to be unravelling somewhat. And we kind of have heard a lot before the election campaign started, and to a certain amount during the campaign, about the kind of Conservative attack line that Labour's union bosses, paymasters, and all the rest of it. But that doesn't seem to ring true when you look at the numbers. Actually, there are a lot of individuals that are giving phenomenal amounts. Lord Sainsbury's, one of them, Gary Lubner is another one. And on the flip side, this week, I think the Conservatives couldn't even muster a top 10 league of donors because they have dropped.
No, and you've got to remember with those donations that actually the ones that are published are only the big ones. What's the limit? Is it 7,500? Below that, it doesn't appear. And what Labour will have been getting loads and loads of is £5 here, £10 there, that the Conservatives won't be getting. So that the amount that Labour's raised is extraordinary.
It is. I mean, and on that point that Kat was making about the union donations now being quite small compared to the other donations. I mean, that's something that I think privately Labour's pleased about, because they don't want to go in spoiling for a fight with the unions, but they know that they're going to have quite a tough relationship with the unions.
Although what happened, remember in the last days before the close of nominations, and lots of candidates were slotted in all over the place. Quite a few of them were union people, but they tended to be the more centrist
Moderate.
unions, like Usdaw, the shop workers.
Well, Usdaw, I noticed, were on the list yesterday of, I think it was £300,000. The FBU, ASLEF, Community. There have been some, but I was looking for Unite as well and didn't see them.
Lindy has messaged in, Lee's messaged in saying, Ayesha, please read the article in The Spectator, Keir's Law by Ross Clark. It's really frightening that Keir is planning on changing so many laws here in the UK. Are the public aware of these changes? They should be made aware of how voting Labour will affect them. Please check it out. It's something that's not been talked about. Well, we've just flagged that up. Lisa has said, I'm not a fan of Keir, but I don't think he will turn left anytime soon. The people that have worked to propel him into number 10, Morgan McSweeney, have worked hard to kick out the hard left group. I think that is true, Lisa. Now, Michael, very quickly, because I do want to move on to the Conservatives, but you want to make a really interesting point about the changing face of how Parliament might look after this election. Very diverse on so many fronts. Just talk to us quickly about that.
Well, I mean, nearly half the MPs may change, for one. The figures for women going up, particularly on the Labour side, even though they had to get rid of the all-women shortlist system for legal reasons. Number of people from ethnic minorities is rising, has been rising for a long time now. Fascinatingly, on the day of London Pride, the number of gay MPs, I think, will go above 100. That's 15%. Could be as much as 120%. I mean, particularly in the Labour ranks, but the other parties too. That trend has been a very marked sign of this election. Hardly any working class MPs. There could be 20 MPs under the age of 30, which I think is a modern record. Nearly all of them Labour, but not entirely. And indeed, there may even be... There's a guy called Sam Carling standing in northwest Cambridgeshire. He probably won't win, but if he does, he could be the youngest a Labour MP ever.
How old is he?
He's just 22. And then there's a woman, Izzy White, who's even younger, standing in northwest Essex. So she could win. She's only 21. So it really is. There's going to be a lot of youngsters there.
So that's going to be interesting. So that is a good thing.
I agree.
Look, we're all... won't be the future anymore.
Yes, yeah. Kat, you'll be like an old aunt like me. You'll be like you'll be like an old granny like me at this point.
I think the lack of experience, though, is a loss.
Right. Jonathan has said, please don't jinx the Labour Party by definitively predicting victory. You've had so many disappointments in the past. That is a very good point, Jonathan. We're absolutely not. I've had my fair share of disappointments. And until that exit poll drops, so many things can happen. As you make a good point, you know, Britain was not meant to leave the EU, according to the polls. Hillary Clinton was meant to beat Donald Trump. So that's a very cautionary tale. Right, we've talked a lot about Labour. We've just got about 5 minutes left. Let's look ahead to what might happen in terms of who the opposition leader, who the opposition may be according to the polls, and what do we think is going to happen with the Conservatives? John, you first briefly.
My tip is James Cleverly.
No.
He's sensible guy. He's got the sort of personality, an engaging personality. I think he's had a good campaign. He's not from either wing of the party. It's interesting that a number of senior Tories, including William Hague, a Times columnist, is now saying they should ditch the idea that he brought in, letting the members choose. I think Alice Thompson was writing that in the Times as well, wasn't she, during the week? They're not going to do that. They might do it at some point in the future. Kemi Badenoch, I'm not convinced about her, I have to say.
Okay.
Tugendhat, I think, will run. And of course, I should start by saying, of course, it depends who's left. If there is going to be a rout of the Tories, that will restrict the number of candidates. I'm not sure about Priti Patel. I'm not sure she's leader material. Cleverly's my
she's
tip.
been moving a bit towards the centre, Priti Patel.
She sort of said that she wouldn't let Nigel in. As
Yeah,
you say,
yeah.
they were very chummy at the
They danced.
Kat, yeah, they did. It was like Strictly Come Dancing sort of audition. Kat, what are your sort of predictions for the Conservatives if, to Jonathan's point, if they lose?
I'm probably a bit more bullish about the opportunity for Priti Patel than it sounds as though either John or Michael are. I think that she's, I think you're right, John. Kemi Badenoch is she is liked by lots of people. She's seen as a strident sort of, person that has that kind of air of authenticity. But she's fallen out with an awful lot of people because of her
does, doesn't she?
authentic
She has that style.
speak truth to literally everyone. She doesn't hold back. So I think she's upset quite a lot of people. She has got some followers, but I think Priti Patel seems to be more sort of collegiate in a lot of ways, and she's kind of taken a bit of backseat. So she's not sort of had the sort of taint of kind of causing a problem, which I think might put Suella Braverman beyond hope. Of course, Penny Mordaunt, if she clings onto her seat, but that is looking increasingly unlikely. And then, I think probably Tom Tugendhat and James Cleverly and Robert Jenrick is also very much himself forward as the sort of standard bearer for the right. So, yeah, it'll be interesting.
Michael.
Well, I mean, actually, I wouldn't play down Priti Patel. I think that she must be a serious contender. I think the other thing that will happen with the parliamentary party is that overall it will move towards the centre, and this great contrast between this country where both parties moving to the centre, and then the rest of the Western world is becoming more and more polarised.
Aren't the activists moving more to the right?
Exactly, and so you've got this bigger gulf than ever between the Conservative MPs and the Conservative activists.
And if the activists are presented with two centrist, boring candidates, they're going to be really unhappy with that.
Well, I suspect they won't be. I suspect they'll be presented with one right-wing candidate and one centrist, or I mean, I don't think it'll be Tom Tugendhat who'll get in, but I think somebody probably Cleverly and one of the right-wingers is where that will then go to the activists. But this is a problem if the members are all sort of. A lot of the members probably will be voting Reform, actually, if we but they'll never admit it. And the members who will be inclined to, welcome Nigel Farage at the opportunity, and the MPs, nearly all the red wallers will disappear, and the remaining, say, 100 seats, a lot of those seats are represented by rather traditional Tories.
And what if a big upset happens, John, and it is Sir Ed Davey who is leader of the opposition? What kind of world is that going to be?
Unlikely.
I mean, the stunts are going to be amazing.
I
he's going to come into PMQs like in clown shoes or something.
Well, although he's managed to get away from the post office issue, which I thought would.
He has been asked about it quite a lot. He was asked about it.
At the question time
I think it was
event.
Nick Robinson the other day.
And at the question time event.
It's not caused him any problem though, and I thought it would do. And but I mean, I think the stunts have gone too far.
No, I disagree. I disagree. I
can't take him seriously.
I wrote a piece for our website a week or so ago, I said he has taken over from Boris Johnson as the king of the photo op. Because can you imagine? Think back to some of the things Johnson used to do. But if you're a third party, you've got to get attention, and everybody's noticed him. And also, as he would argue, splashing around on Lake Windermere makes a point about polluted water.
And
it can't be that polluted if he's willing to jump into it 4 times.
He's also got a loyalty card for like Thorpe Park. He's been a one-man fiscal stimulus for
He's probably
Thorpe
sponsored
Park.
by Thorpe Park.
The other point I want to make, just coming to the end, is Scotland is going to be really, really important. You know, it's going to be really interesting to see if Labour does have this revival in Scotland. And the important thing for sort of watchers of Scottish politics is there's really important Holyrood elections coming up in 2026. So Labour is going to have to really show that they can deliver for people in Scotland. Otherwise, you know, John Swinney and Kate Forbes and Stephen Flynn will have a big argument in terms of, well, you know, you might have changed who's in Westminster. So that is a really important thing to look out for.